Okay, so
So
anyway.
now I press got it?
Yep, so it should be recording now. And then I'll say, hi Felicity, and thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited to be talking to you. For many of the people who are watching this interview, I assume that they know all about who you are and your involvement with the society. But just in case they don't, I wondered if you could start by taking us back to where it all began. What drew you into philosophy and how did you become involved in PESA to begin with?
No, I'm a generation where people won't know me, won't know who I am. But I was very lucky. I had a Latin teacher at school who used to insist on clarity of expression more than my English teacher, who used to teach us the correct grammar. And she had no understanding of irony or satire or anything. And she used to teach us Jane Austen, literally. And it used to drive me mad. So I used to drive most of my teachers mad by asking open-ended questions in class, which would fluster them incredibly. So my Latin teacher drew my attention to the existence of Greek philosophers. And so it was great. When I first enrolled at uni as a teacher, they didn't want me to do philosophy because philosophy wasn't a subject then taught in schools at all. But I insisted. I did it as an extra subject. And I loved it. I always loved it. But to do it as an official subject was just lovely. My father was a classic scholar. So he had copies of Plato's Republic on the bookshelves, and Homer, and the Iliad, and the Odyssey. And so my attention was drawn already to Greek philosophers. It was good. And my grandfather was also a scholar and used to have long discussions with me about the meaning of existence and whether religion was important. He was a bishop, an Anglican bishop.
Wow.
So my heritage was really philosophy.
Yeah, so you've sort of had philosophy there the whole way through, from the very beginning, and asking those philosophical questions from when you were in school even. How did you become involved in PESA?
Let me remember that. The first trip I ever had was to New Zealand. And I have to confess, no, I taught philosophy of education under Bert Priest, who learned of it in New Zealand when he was there. When Richard Peters was visiting.
Wow.
So how long ago was that? And he was wonderful. He introduced it to the Diploma of Education. And so that was where I first learnt it. And he put it into the compulsory Dip Ed course when I joined the department. But he was very insightful. He employed 3 philosophers of education at the increased size of the Department of Education. 3 philosophers of education in one department of only 21 staff.
Wow.
So that was fairly enterprising.
Yeah, wow.
And I was one of them.
That's amazing. And then I know you've had a really long history involved in PESA. You have a lecture that's named after you as well, you and Bruce, and you were one of the first female elected presidents we ever had, and all of these wonderful things. And so you clearly had a very big role in the history of philosophy of education in Australia in the past. And I'm wondering, what are your hopes for philosophy more broadly for the future?
That it becomes a fixed part of the curriculum framework. Really, I was involved in rewriting the curriculum framework when John Dawkins introduced those new changes to the curriculum. And we had to find behavioural objectives for every subject area. And we thought that was really impossible for philosophy as a separate subject area. So in Western Australia, at least, we succeeded in making it a key, not just a key learning area, but an overarching framework which would inform all subjects, so that in science, you would be doing philosophy of science as a higher level order of thinking. I can't remember the phrase they use now. And in English, of course, clarity of expression became more conceptual analysis, like philosophy. So we didn't call it philosophy, but we let it permeate the whole framework. So that was quite exciting. That
Yeah.
was at the turn of the century, 2001, I think it was. And that was power. When we had one rigorous behaviourist head of department, he refused to make philosophy of education a compulsory subject for training teachers at the university. And so it became an option at master's level. And that was the beginning of the decline of philosophy in the education department at uni. But it still remained part of the curriculum framework in secondary schools. And I think that was probably one of my biggest achievements.
And so is your hope moving forward that philosophy is centred more both in the curriculum but also in initial teacher education?
Well, I'd like to see it not as a subject area, but an overarching framework statement that exists in higher order thinking skills in all subject areas. But this requires teachers, of course, to be capable of higher order thinking skills, and many of them are not trained to do that. So I think the revolution has to be that it becomes part of the teacher training program.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And I think it brings us to the next question I was going to ask you about what you think has been lost. And you've already started to speak about what's been lost in higher education, but also what's been lost in the curriculum and also education more broadly. Thinking back to that then, like what are those key things that you think we've actually lost, or the things we need to refocus on in order to get teachers to think about critical thinking and to have it as a more prioritised overall approach for education?
I think we have changed quite a bit from the beginning of the century. That there wasn't an emphasis on imaginative thinking, on creative thinking, on critical thinking, and all of those things are included in philosophy and are part of it. But I think now philosophy takes that broader definition and does inform it. I mean, there is more philosophy of science done in the science subjects, and I think that's terrific. So, but it also requires intelligence teachers, and it requires them to have done at least critical thinking in their teacher training courses, at least. English teachers are better at it than science teachers. We tend to have a belief in the solidity of fact and not the surprise of conjecture.
Interesting. Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think about that with my students sometimes as well. I think the question
so
that
you teach English?
I studied English teaching as in my undergraduate, and now I work with initial teacher education students too. And it's interesting the types of disciplinary knowledge and the kinds of conversations students want to be having. But I find that even when they are of different sort of paradigms in how they think about things, they'll still come to the table and bring in those different critical perspectives when they're given the opportunity to have those conversations, which is always really fascinating.
Well, I love you use the word paradigm. Yeah, the trouble I have when I first introduced that to my DPed students.
I'm not sure if I use it well, but I remember it.
Understand what it can. And of course, this was the 1970s, and Kuhn was very new. So we had to go into the whole notion of paradigms in a way that I don't think you have to now. I think postmodern philosophy and that sort of area made us much more aware of frames of conjecture, or ways of framing your argument to suit your own expectations and premises. So things have changed.
Yeah, and I think also it's like opening up those little questions that you're asking your school teachers, the why or the what if. And I think when thinking about, science as an example, it's all a theory until it's disproven, right? There's always a question of what could be or why is it important. And
when I first started teaching it, it was one of the compulsory courses at postgraduate level. And I'd start off with them, why are you teaching what you're teaching? And the question really shocked them. They were teaching them because they had a major in that subject area. Well, what is important about your subject area in schools? Oh my God, you're asking us to think about that?
Yeah.
Don't question that. That's our set of values that we're locked into.
Yeah. And as you know, the landscape shifts, and as we focus on particular things we're teaching our initial teacher education students, or things we want to teach our school students, even, you sort of shy away from those harder questions there. I'm curious, what role do you think that philosophers of education like you, or people coming up, you know, like me and other people who are in the association more broadly, what role do they have in facilitating these sorts of conversations that you're talking about, in actually opening these dialogues with teachers and students more generally?
I think the emphasis on dialogue in schools was a healthy change, that they emphasised conversation, which required interchange and exchange of ideas in an informal session. The big influence on that was Lawrence Splitter from Wollongong. And he really, oh, well, are you from Wollongong too?
I'm not from Wollongong, I'm from
was.
Newcastle, but I've seen him referenced in some of your works before around PESA and things like that. Yeah.
Well, he just sort of set up this idea of community of inquiry that he got from Anne Sharp and Matthew Lipman.
Yep.
And that whole notion of actually not being teacher-centered because the teacher had a superior knowledge, but in letting the class students formulate the questions that were being asked, and then have an open, what they call a community of inquiry.
Yeah.
That was influential in getting kids to think for themselves, the capacity to think for themselves, and to argue and defend their own position. And I think that was really important. I don't know whether we'd call it philosophy, but it seemed to me the core thing of critical inquiry, if you want to say that they had to defend their own positions rationally.
It's funny you say that we're not sure if we call that philosophy, because one of the questions that I was thinking about asking is, you know, what is philosophy? But that's such a big question. But I think when you're talking about doing philosophy, those dialogues and things that they talk about in the community of inquiry and things like that are really valuable, right? You're practicing doing philosophy with kids, which is really valuable, especially for values education and things like that. Yeah, that's an interesting point. I have more questions that I want to ask you, but I think I probably should save some of those for the conference, which leads me to my final question then. You're one of our members of our Looking Back panel at the 50th anniversary conference in December. And I wondered, is there anything in particular that you're looking forward to discussing at the conference, be it in the panel or, you know, in the line for lunch? What are you looking forward to?
Isn't it funny? What's the future? What's the future of philosophy, for instance? I think it's interesting. I think we have succeeded in getting beyond behavioural outcomes. Thank goodness, because that was the big threat to philosophy at the beginning of the century. So that I'm looking forward to classrooms or teachers being able to enter into dialogue with their kids, which might actually be the demise of the teacher. If they can encourage the kids to organise themselves into a community of inquiry, the teacher becomes redundant. So the classroom, I don't know whether this is a good idea to say this, but they need teachers at some stage, especially in primary school, to facilitate the kids' ability to think rationally, to enter into conversation, which is a genuine conversation. And if they do that, they make themselves redundant, especially with the arrival of the internet, where kids can search out both their own topics and follow their questions of interest on themselves. I think we don't make enough use of the inquiry methods that are encouraged through the internet. If we have a set curriculum, no. If the teacher asks interesting questions and encourage the children to go and ask more questions and look it up on the internet, then I think we've made sufficient progress.
Yeah, and I think that the point you made there raises questions about the role of the teacher, and go back to the point you made earlier about why are you teaching this particular thing? So why does the curriculum matter? Why does this part of the curriculum matter? Why does the pedagogy matter? Why does the teacher matter? And how are those roles all defined? It's a really, really interesting point. And I am very keen to discuss that more with you in December, because I think that that would be a very long and exciting conversation to have. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we wrap up?
No, what a delight it is to talk to someone intelligent for a change. My cat doesn't answer back intelligently. He doesn't appreciate my philosophical conversations. So thanks for the interview. That's very very pleasant.
Thank you so much for your time, Felicity. It's been an honour to talk to you.
Thanks.